Well, hey, friends, let's resume our study of Philemon and Colossians, specifically Colossians. Sorry that we missed last week. I wasn't feeling very well, and I've gotten a doctor and some medicine on my side, and I'm much, much better and now. We were just beginning chapter 2 of Colossians, and maybe this brief interlude gives us a chance to back off a little bit and look at this letter, this 4 chapter letter that Paul wrote to a church where he had never been, and think some about the big message and how it might apply to you and me. And the big message is Jesus is really all we need. Jesus is really all we need. Jesus is enough. But we don't need to improve on Eden. Um, the more scholarly works will say that Colossians has a theme of the preeminence of Christ, or maybe more contemporary, the supremacy of Christ. But I prefer to put it in a more vernacular. Jesus is really enough, and this we can see this pretty easily if we just look at the vocabulary, if we just look at the words that Paul uses as he writes the letter. For example, in chapter 1, he uses the word Christ 12 times. He, uh, he uses the word him, referring to Christ, 6 times. And chapter 2, Christ appears 11 times, and again, word him, referring to Christ, 6 times. Chapter 3, only 9 times he uses the word Christ, and 2 pronoun references. In chapter 4, only 3 references to Christ. But it's almost that he can't cram enough Jesus into the text, and he seems to be pushing back against some false teaching that's going around. And he's fearful that it's going around there in Colossae and down the road at Laodicea and maybe even Ephesus, that Jesus is nice, but we really need something else besides. It's so much more exciting. It's so much more fulfilling if you have these other things. And this other thing that we're talking about, the scholarly term for it is some syncretism. It's a blending of beliefs, and that's a big problem for us today. Back then, you took a little Christianity, you took a little Judaism, the Jewish religion, some of the other things that were going around the region at that time. Mystery religions were a big deal, and then some ideas that later, about 100 years later, reappear as Gnosticism. This word comes from that word gnosis, the Greek word that means knowledge, and survives today with lots of different things. Some of you may work in the field of pharmacognosy. It's got that GNO, phrasing in it there. Agnostic is a term that was means I don't know. So that's the word. Gnosticism is still an echo in our language. But back then, the idea was, well, Jesus is okay, but you need to have all this special knowledge. And then besides Jesus, to really get to God, there are all these angels, there are all these other heavenly beings. Jesus is just kind of a member of the cast when you get right down to it. So what sort of ideas are out there today that tend to dilute Jesus in our church, in our Christian walk? And in many cases, these are good things. It's just a case of moving the focus off of Jesus, pushing him a little bit into the background. One is the idea of social justice, of using the church, of using Christianity as a political force, frankly, in our world to push back against inequality, whether that's political or economic, and to make sure that everyone, regardless of their race or gender or economic background, has equal opportunity. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, that's woven into the whole idea of the United States of America. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, all persons are created equal. That's as basic as it gets as far as what this country is all about. But even though that's a good thing, and I would argue that that's a value that comes directly from Christianity, from the Bible, it's not the main point of the story. Jesus is the main point of the story. We can see an emphasis on, various forms of political action, or the worship experience itself, and achieving some sort of an emotional response in worship, and that can almost take away from the main object of our worship, which is God and Jesus. And then there's the idea of centering around some sort of a great charismatic leader, and this comes again and again in Christianity. We'll see a whole movement that is really centered on the personality of a particular individual. And while this individual may point to Jesus, somehow our focus gets a little bit off, and we're more concerned with what Mary says or Chuck says or what Brother X has said than really what Jesus has said. And then there are various ideas that talk about where there's a strict code of conduct. And yes, the teachings of Jesus and the New Testament are good, but we need to have more detailed guidelines. And we want to enforce these detailed guidelines. And if you don't follow these detailed guidelines, then somehow you're less than, or maybe you're not even saved. And this is an idea that comes up again and again historically, and Paul really pushes back against that here in this Colossians letter. Well, let's just start today, if you don't mind, by looking back at chapter 2 and reading those first 6 verses. He says, I want you to know how hard I am contending for you and for those at Laodicea, and for all those who have not met me personally. He mentions Laodicea twice in this letter, once here and once in chapter 4 and verse 16. He's going to tell him in verse 16, now make sure you read the letter I wrote to Laodicea and let them read this letter. Swap letters. Laodicea only 10, 15 miles down the road, and so there's probably a lot of interaction between these two. I'm going to say small, I don't know how small they were, but small congregations, young for sure, young congregations in the Lord. And some people think that actually the Laodicean letter was the book of Ephesians that we have. Well, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but the idea I have is that Paul wrote a lot of letters to a lot of churches and a lot of people. We don't have all of them. At any rate, he says, my goal is that they may be encouraged in heart and united in love, so they may have the full riches of complete understanding, in order that they may know the mystery of God, namely Christ. There's that word again. In whom are hidden all treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Paul pushing back against this idea of mystery and knowledge, and you got to have something extra. He says Jesus is all there is. If you want mystery, if you want knowledge, it's all here. I tell you this so that no one may deceive you by fine sounding arguments. For though I'm absent from you in body, I am present with you in spirit, and delight to see how disciplined you are and how firm your faith in, here's this word again, Christ is. Well, it's almost like a teenager going out the door, and the parent is warning them of certain things on their way out. And you know how, if you've had teenagers at your house, you know how this works. Or if you've been a teenager, you know how this works. The parent needs to get in the last few warnings. And so there's warnings here in verse 4. He says, I'm telling you this so that no one may deceive you by fine sounding arguments. It's like fast talk. It's somebody's gonna pull wool. They're gonna fool you. They're gonna deceive you, and so you need to pay attention to what I'm saying. Then down in verse 8, we haven't gotten there in what I was reading a minute ago, but just skip on down to verse 8. And incidentally, the entire passage is on the back of your sheet today. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy. So Paul is really appealing to them to think carefully about the doctrines, about the teaching that they're being presented with. Then in the second half of chapter 2, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because basically it's concerns of the first century, he lists a long bullet points here of things that these false teachers were trying to to convince people of there in Colossae. And you can, it's a great exercise for you to look down through the second half of the chapter, starting about verse 16, and look at all the things that he warns them against. There's about, what, 5 verses here. And he warns them against these things. He says, uh, first of all, somebody's going to tell you that you need to be careful about what you eat and what you drink. And then they're going to judge you with regard to a religious festival, a new moon, or a Sabbath day. He said these people, they tend to have a lot of false humility. Boy, now that's a good one. False humility. Um, it creeps in so easily. Someone who portrays such a good heart, and they're on the side of the right, and they're on your side too, and they're just so humble, and they dare not tell you this, but somebody's got to speak up, and so they'll be the one to do it. And in Charles Dickens' great novel David Copperfield, there's this character Uriah Heep, who's guilty of false humility, and it's almost impossible to talk about false humility without thinking about Uriah Heep. So Paul says these people are full of false humility. They want to talk about the worship of angels. The worship of angels. Now, angels are great in the New Testament. They appear when Jesus is born, and they appear at the tomb. They bookend his life. They appear. Well, there's a voice that appears, a spirit like a dove, but that's really not an angel at his baptism. But so his birth, his resurrection, they kind of bookend things there. And then when he ascends into heaven, the angels come and say, "What are you guys hanging out here for? Go to Jerusalem. He's going to meet you there." So at any rate, they're not intended to be worshipped. Okay, we don't worship angels. And there was this idea back then that if you disciplined yourself, if you treated your body harshly, you didn't eat, you didn't sleep, you would have a vision and you'd go to heaven. Spiritually speaking, you'd be elevated to heaven and you would see angels worshiping there. You would have a vision of angel worship in heaven. Woo! Wouldn't that be something? And you'd come back and tell people all about what you had seen and heard. And so Paul here is kind of making fun of it. He says they go into great detail about what they've seen and heard. So we have this warning about be careful what people tell you, and then all these false doctrines. But in the middle, we have the section that I really want us to focus on today, and that is a very important operation. Have you had an operation? I mean, a medical procedure where they, cut you open and do something? Usually, you ask people that question. You need to get comfortable because they want to tell you all about it. I had a broken shoulder back in 1999 bicycle wreck, and to put everything back together, the surgeon put in this screw. I'm going to hold it over here so I've got a little plastic bag here, but this is actually the screw, class, that was in my shoulder. He put it in, he left it in there for a while, and then he took it back out, and I have it in my drawer now, and the shoulder works pretty well. I can show you the scar if you want to see. No, you probably don't want to see my scar, but people get they are very. It's a life-changing thing to have an operation. I'm going to have a special guest talk to us about one of his surgeries, one of his operations, just to focus your idea on this idea of a life-changing operation. Then we're going to talk about a life-changing operation that I hope you have had, or if you haven't, that I'd like to give you. So let's or I'd like to help you get. Let's just hold on a second. So, as a special guest on our class today, one of our elders, Dr. Eric Dahl, has agreed to join us. Who better to talk about their own operation than a medical doctor with 40 years experience? And yes, sometimes they get sick too, and they have to have some sort of help. Eric, tell us, you've had a few operations.
Yes, I have, Doug, and I don't mind talking about them because the one that I'm going to mention is getting rid of a rotten appendix. Well, first, let me say thanks for doing this, and thanks for your classmates who come and listen every week and continue to want to pursue the Word of God and be spreaders of the kingdom. I really appreciate that in this difficult time of staying connected, your class is staying connected, and I really appreciate that. Back to the appendix.
We're great. It's great to have you on, and in the future, I'll let my class know we have to have Eric back to talk about a matter of faith. But today we're going to talk about his. We talked recently about how the word for heart and then the Greek word is entrails. So we're going to talk to him about his entrails today. So
That's right. So when I was in high school, I was usually able to get myself up after Mom had gone to work and take myself to school. One morning I got up and immediately collapsed, fell over and couldn't meet my carpool. And my belly was hurting extremely badly. So I called Mom. She came home from work. We went to the doctor's office and sat for about 7 hours with bad belly pain. And the doctor saw me and then immediately sent me to the hospital. And happily, an old friend from church was there as an anesthesiologist to put me to sleep. And I didn't mind going to sleep at all because I was hurt so badly. Then they, of course, did the operation, took out the appendix, and I woke up feeling much better.
Well, so the 7 hour wait, what was that all about?
Well, it was back in the day where you didn't have a fast track in the doctor's office, and I didn't have an appointment, and Dr. Charles Parrott was a very busy doctor, and nobody was doing triage like we do in the emergency room nowadays. But so they had a young man who's fairly healthy with a bellyache sitting in the doctor's office until he could work us in.
Oh man!
Once he saw me and touched my belly, he said, "We're getting him to the hospital now."
Well, that was great. So when a person does, when a surgeon does an appendectomy, removes the, without getting too detailed, kind of just tell us what happened. They put you to sleep and then?
They put you to sleep, and then in those days, they would make about an 8-inch cut in your lower right belly and dissect through the muscles and open things up and elevate the appendix where they can get to it and cut it out and sew up the colon where they took it out. Nowadays,
and the appendix is how, the size of my little finger?
The size of your finger.
Mm-hmm.
I think mine was about the size of my thumb by the time they got it out, but
so swollen and disease and everything, and
swollen and leaking and really angry.
Yeah. Well, so let me ask kind of a dumb question here, but I think it leads into some of the points we're going to make in our lesson. Could you have that operation reversed
and put the appendix back in? No, it was dead and rotten and has long been put away.
Okay, suppose the doctor told you and your mother, we need to take his appendix out, and you, for whatever reason, said, no, you're not going to cut me open and take something of my, I'm not going to do that. Then what happens?
Well, the most likely outcome of that would have been death, because it was rotten and leaking, and if it ruptures, it releases poison into the peritoneal or the belly cavity where there are not supposed to be any germs, and your body gets overwhelmed with sepsis and your blood pressure drops and your heart stops.
So it was we talked about the word life-changing earlier as far as a medical procedure like this goes. It was life-saving. There was no life on the other side of this for you.
That's right. That's right. And in my case, with the appendix, I was ready to get rid of it because I'd been in such pain for the whole day,
mm-hmm.
and glad to be done with it.
It reminds me of Jesus' statement of those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. And I'm going to show the class. I will show the class. I'm going to show you a little screw that was put in me one time, and when the doctor got ready to do this, I said, "Can you do it today? Can you do it now?" And so that was the attitude. Well, we really appreciate your sharing with us, Eric, and we hope God will bless you this weekend. And we'll look forward to being with you. Lord willing, maybe even see you on Sunday. We'll see how I'm feeling then, but we hope to be together then, okay?
Well, bless you and keep you. And let me say a blessing over your class, that the God of hope will fill you all with joy and peace as you trust in him through this difficult time, so that your life will overflow with hope for a world that is in fear and anxiety. And may that be by the power of the Spirit. God bless
Brother,
you.
we
Thank you, Doug.
appreciate that blessing so much. We'll talk to you later.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you, Brother Eric, for sharing very personally part of your life story with us about that Well, what on earth am I talking about? Well, here let's just take a look here at Colossians chapter 2, and bear in mind that Paul is trying to give them some good, healthy understanding, some good, healthy thinking about what it takes to be right with God. And so we're going to look in chapter 2 and verse 11. You can look on the back of your sheet if you want to. In him, of course, referring to Jesus, you were also circumcised with a circumcision not performed by human hands. Your whole self, ruled by the flesh, was put off when you were circumcised by Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through your faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. When you were dead in your sins and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive with Christ. I'm going to stop right there. You know, circumcision is not a popular topic. It's kind of personal, it's kind of private. And so we just don't talk about it a lot, but Paul couldn't seem to talk about it enough. Nowadays, there's another reason we don't talk about it very much because it's kind of boring. Now, if you happen to be a parent that's expecting a little boy baby, then you may want to read up on it. You'll probably talk to the pediatrician about it and, make some decisions for your son about what's best for him. But other than that, we just kind of something we just don't like to bring up that much. But it's really a big deal here in Colossians 2. It's a big deal in Galatians and elsewhere in the New Testament. And the reason why is, and you see a box on the front side of your sheet that has a lot of the important scriptures, is that it was essential under the Old Testament law, the Jewish religion, for you to be in covenant relationship with God. This is a covenant that predates the law of Moses. So it predates almost everything else about their religion. It was so essential because if you weren't circumcised, you weren't in the community. And to them, being under the covenant and in the community was everything, was everything. In fact, in the New Testament in particular, they use the expression the circumcision to refer to Jews, to people who are in this special community. And Paul resists the idea that you have to be circumcised to be right with God. But then in Philippians 3:3, he says, we, meaning Christians, are the circumcision. And he makes this point there on your sheet in Romans chapter 2. He says, for a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is a true circumcision something external and physical. Rather, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and real circumcision is a matter of the heart. It is spiritual and not literal. Whether you're male or female, or whether you're Jewish or Asian or Hispanic or African American, it doesn't matter. This idea of a spiritual circumcision is very important to you. And so Paul is pushing back a little bit against people that might come to Colossae and say, well, you've been baptized, but if you want to be right with God, if you're male, you need to be circumcised too, like all of us Jews are. He's saying, hey, wait a minute, wait a minute. The circumcision that really matters is not the removal of this little skin and tissue physically from the male organ. Instead, it's the removal of this sinful covering over your heart, to peel away all those sins. How does he put it here? It says Your whole self, ruled by the flesh, was put off when you were circumcised by Christ. That's what we need to get rid of. Just like that diseased appendix that Dr. Eric was telling us about. We've got to get that out. And in fact, he says you have been. It's done without human hands. That sounds like some really high-tech surgery, doesn't it? Done without human hands. He says you were circumcised by Christ when you were baptized. Now, let me get on a little bit of a soapbox here and say that I decry the infrequency with which we talk about baptism and we teach about baptism. Uh, it should be a part of our diet because and Paul wrote this to people who had been baptized. Okay, it wasn't an evangelistic letter per se. It was written to mature and disciple people who were already Christians, already baptized. Same thing in Romans chapter 6, one of the possibly the greatest, section just dealing with baptism in the whole New Testament. That's written to people who already been baptized. It was trying to help them understand the significance of what they had done. And so it is here. And we need to spend more time. The beautiful, powerful symbols of baptism, of being, as it says here and in Romans chapter 6, buried with him. We take that old sinful person who is dead, dead. How do you think people would react today if Paul came back and started preaching that people who hadn't been baptized into Christ were spiritually dead? We think, well, baptism is a beautiful symbol, and it's a great thing to do, and we all want to encourage and help people that are considering baptism or want to be baptized. We'll take time to observe their baptism and witness it, and it's a nice thing. But to tell people, look, you're dead, and this is the way to life. That's what Paul thought about it, and that's what he taught about it. It was so important. Uh, well, if we look a little deeper into into what the Bible teaches about baptism, we'll see that throughout the Old Testament, although there was this tremendous emphasis on circumcision as being a part of being in the community, and when a boy baby was born, just like when Jesus was born, on the eighth day, no matter what, the baby boy was circumcised. It could be a Sabbath day. It could be some sort of religious festival. It could be wartime. It could be epidemic. It could be on the eighth day, the baby boy was circumcised, so he wouldn't be left out of the covenant. So he wouldn't be left out of the community, because Paul said, God said to Abraham, he said, any male who's not circumcised is cut off from among his people. He's he's worse than illegitimate. He's just not part of you anymore. He's not your brother. He's not your son. But when he is circumcised, he becomes a part of your covenant. It goes from your great grandfather, grandfather, father, son, grandson, and so forth and so on. He becomes a part of it. Well, there's this emphasis, as I just said, on physical circumcision, the eighth day, that sort of thing. But again, we run into this expression, circumcision of the heart. That's not just New Testament, that's Old Testament too. And you see just one of those references there, Deuteronomy 36. And then Paul makes a very eloquent statement that I just read in Romans chapter 2. There are other places in the Bible that talk about the circumcision of the heart. So Paul is playing off these earlier references here in chapter 2 when he talks about the great significance of the operation that all of us who are Christians have undergone and how life-changing that is. We'd never want to put that appendix back in there. We'd never want. I'm so glad that this screw is in my drawer now and not in my shoulder anymore. I don't want to put it back. I don't want to go back there anymore. It has been it's been healing and life-changing that we've had this done, and now we're whole, and now we're blessed in so many ways to be a part of the faith community of all of the people who have been circumcised by Christ, and buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through your faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. And so something else happens here too, and this is important for us to understand how to study and understand the Bible. It's often comes up that people lift a passage out of the Old Testament and they they try to apply it to the way we should live today. And this is an example. It's real life, and it's a problem for a lot of people, but a bit extreme. But in the Ten Commandments, the God commands the people to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Do no work on the Sabbath day. And people used to think that as Christians, that meant we should not do any work at all on Sunday. Well, we could spend a lot of time talking about the benefits of observing Sabbath time as Christians, setting aside time just for our spiritual lives. But as far as a legal requirement that we do no work at all one day a week, whether it's Saturday, which is actually the seventh day, is Saturday, or Sunday, uh, that is no longer binding on us. Well, why? Is it because somebody in Washington D.C. in 1836 made a decision about that, or so did some Congress vote on it? A bunch of religious leaders? No, Paul spells it out here very clearly in Colossians. He says, we'll look here again in verse 13. When you were dead in your sins and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive with Christ. He forgave us all our sins, and then this 14, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and condemned us. He has taken it away, nailing it to the cross. Now, this by no means is the only place that this teaching is found in the New Testament. You could take the entire book of Hebrews, for example. But hear this reference to the charge of our legal indebtedness. He's taken it away, nailing it to the cross. Uh, Most scholars agree that this is a dead-on reference to the law of Moses and all the requirements of the Old Testament, including a Levitical priesthood, worship in the temple, animal sacrifice, observing the Sabbath day, and so forth. Well, people will say, well, wait a minute. Oh, you don't believe in the Ten Commandments? You don't believe that we should not covet, that we should not love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, that we should not uh, avoid taking the Lord's name in vain, that we shouldn't honor our parents? Well, it turns out that these commands, by and large, are repeated in the New Testament, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, and amplified. And amplified. The bar is just it gets higher. So it is, as Paul wrote to Timothy, important for us to learn to rightly divide the word of truth. And one of my favorite examples is people often cite the examples of instrumental music in the Old Testament, in the Psalms, and in stories about worship at the temple, and therefore the church today should use instrumental music. Now, you know, maybe instrumental music is a great idea, maybe it's not. That's an important topic to talk about another time. But don't justify it based upon the Old Testament unless you're going to have animal sacrifice and Levitical priesthood and everything else, and ignore what Paul says here in Colossians chapter 2. Uh, well, at any rate, where we find ourselves coming to here is that Paul points again to the tremendous change that's available to us having been circumcised by Christ and having all of this sinful self, this deadness, uh, cut away and done away with. And so he says, this idea that you need to follow some set of arbitrary rules to give you a higher experience than you can get through Christ is just wrong. He refers to this in the last paragraph of the chapter. In verse 22, he says, "These rules, which have to do with things that are all destined to perish with use, are based on merely human commands and teachings." Human commands and teachings. Such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom. With their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. And so we're going to stop there today with the idea that, as our beloved preacher Bob Brewer used to say, the heart of the matter is a matter of the heart. And we can come up with a great set of rules, a great program to regulate our behavior. And I'm all in favor of self-discipline, spiritual formation, of putting God first in a very methodical way. But in the end, it has to be our heart that restrains sensual indulgence, that it's a religion all about love and faith and hope. Well, next week we're going to move right into the practical application of all the heavy theology that we waded through in chapters 1 and 2. We'll be studying chapter 3, and I hope you can be back with us at that time. God bless you, and say a prayer for me this week, as I will also pray for you.